The topic of my talk is going to be about culture and democratization. I think it's something that has not been mentioned yet in the debates. I think it's certainly important to mention and to look at the role of culture when we think both about democracy and development. I think it's going to be quite complementary to the talks, not just today, but also yesterday. So if we look at the research on democratization since 1959, Lipset's famous article has turned around the democratization hypothesis and whether and to what extent income per capita and measures of development are determinants of democratization, and what are the mechanisms linking income per capita to democratization, whether it's urbanization, whether it's education, whether it's making democracy irreversible. So this is clearly one of the main research areas in political science, and Professor Jaworski's talk yesterday was really quite illuminating in terms of explaining where we stand, etc. So I'm going to report a little bit of research that I have done with my colleague Yuri Gorodnichenko, where we look at the role of culture on both income per capita and also democratization. Economists have, I would say, finally, in recent years, started to take culture seriously. It's something that was really completely taboo, and still is taboo among many people, to try to understand both theoretically and empirically the economic effects of cultural differences. And so I'm going to look at the effect of culture on democratization and its possible link with income per capita, which are really the themes of the conference. So first of all, what do we mean by culture? That's point number one. Definition that is now accepted by economists is that culture has to be seen as a set of values and beliefs people have about how the world works. That's nature, but it's also society, and also the norms of behavior that are derived from that set of values. So this is a very comprehensive definition. People who ask what is the link with religion, there is an overlap with religion, because religion carries values, what is fundamental, and what makes meaning in one's life, values, beliefs, etc. But I would argue that culture is somewhat more inclusive, because it really includes all these values and beliefs. And maybe we could argue that culture probably evolves somewhat more than religion, though that is something debatable. But certainly one thing that most people working on culture agree with is that culture has an enormous inertia. They don't change very quickly. It's something that's been there for hundreds of years and changes only very, very slowly. So by culture, we do not mean, culinary clothing habits, or sometimes, that's the definition of culture. That's certainly not the one that economists talk about. Now, when we think of culture, this is very vast. How do we think about cultural differences? And I'm going to take the starting point that's been most studied in social sciences, which is the field of cross-cultural psychology. And cross-cultural psychologists, they argue, and they have done dozens and dozens of psychological experiments, that the main cultural dimension that matters across the world, across countries, is the difference between individualism and collectivism. So several things. First of all, it's clear that culture has many, many dimensions. So we can only bring it back to one dimension. But you have to start with something, and this axis of individualism versus collectivism is certainly very useful in terms of, at least in the first step, to understand cultural differences. And it's very, very important to be clear about what we understand by individualism and collectivism. This is not about selfishness versus altruism. This is not about being pro-market versus socialist, communist, or etc. This is very different. It's really about views of the world, beliefs about how the world works, values about what gives meaning to people's life. So, very, very shortly, just to give you an idea of where I'm going, individualistic culture emphasizes the importance of individual achievement. That is, people receive social status rewards from standing out, from individual achievement, from individual success, be it economic, artistic, scientific, humanitarian, be it in any dimension. It's not just about money, it's really about standing out. This is something that brings prestige in the individualist culture. The collectivist culture, on the other hand, emphasizes more conformity and embeddedness in larger groups and tends to frown on deviation from conformity. There, the people receive prestige from being good members of the community, from fitting well, from being able to adapt to the needs of their community, etc. And so Plateau is one of the first who looked at this in the context of economic development. Now, it turns out that, as I said, there's a really huge literature, and this difference between individualism and collectivism is associated with big differences in the way people look at themselves, in the way motivation is structured, what motivates people, how they make choices, the degree of effort that they choose, people's relational mobility, the behavior towards what is called the in-group and the out-group, and even cognitive differences, the way that people perceive things happening to them. So we wrote a survey about this, and it has actually many dimensions. It matters not just for what I'm going to talk about today, it matters for attitudes towards migration, attitudes towards labor market institutions, etc., etc. So, let's not be philosophical, let's try to be empirical. How do we measure individualism? So the measure of individualism that is mostly accepted by researchers is that was established by Hofstede. He's a Dutch sociologist. And initially he made surveys among IBM employees across the world. That was already in the 60s and 70s. IBM was then the biggest company in the world, had headquarters, had subsidiaries everywhere. And so he was trying to understand cultural differences within a corporation. So a little bit the method that is used is that what he did is that you take a person who has the same position in the company, be it director of accounting or marketing, across the different countries, and then you ask them a lot of questions about their values, and you see what comes out. So this was generalized quite recently, actually, to more than 90 countries. So initially from 50 to 70 to now 90. And so this is based on factor analysis of survey questions. So what is measured by this, there are many questions, but clearly individualism is associated with people valuing individual freedom, opportunity, achievement, advancements, and recognition, and negatively associated with valuing harmony, cooperation, good relations with superiors, which are values that are more closely associated with collectivism. And so one reason the Hofstede measures are very popular is that if you take the ranking of countries along that axis, people who have done other studies with other professions, be it teachers, lawyers, airplane pilots, whatever, usually the rankings are pretty similar. So the countries that are more individualistic, countries that are more collectivist, there's widespread consensus on how to do this. Another measure which is also quite popular is by Israeli cultural psychologist Shalom Schwartz, where he comes up with sort of different concepts. and he has one concept where he looks at what is called intellectual autonomy, also affective autonomy versus embeddedness, and these dimensions are quite correlated with the Hofstadter data. So just to give you an idea, so this is a little bit the map of the individualism and collectivism, and the colors are more or less the same as on my computer. So as you would guess, the more individualistic countries are, the Anglo-Saxon countries, the US, the UK, Australia, European countries are quite individualistic. The more collectivist countries, as you see, this is the dark blue, which is, you have a lot of that in Asia, Indochina, Indonesia, China, also Pakistan, some African countries, some countries in the Andes region. Those are among the more collectivist countries. And then you have a lot of countries that are in between, such as Mexico, Brazil, Russia. And you see that actually if you look at, so they don't have measures for, they have no measures for Tunisia, they have no measures for Algeria, but Morocco is probably a little bit more on the individualistic side, is a little bit comparable to Spain, and then you have Egypt, Turkey, etc. So many of the MENA countries are a little bit in between, and in Asia, India is clearly the most individualistic country. So anyway, how does this relate to democratization? So the idea I want to explore with you is that cultural values affect the direction of institutional change when there is a window of collective action. Events like the Arab Spring or revolutionary events, if we think of in history, the 60s, 1830, 1848, so they come pretty rarely. There you have events where you have quite important collective action. And so the question is, this collective action, to what kind of change does it lead? When you have a revolution, when you have some elite revolt, when you have a coup, etc., what direction does it go? And so the idea is that revolts do not necessarily lead to democracy. It's never been like that. If you look at history, there were many, many revolts. So revolts leading to democracy are more recent, and in certain specific countries, and revolts may lead to a particular autocratic regime. So it's clearly not the case that it leads automatically to democracy. So this is where culture plays a role. And so the idea is that individualistic culture creates demand for democracy, because if people in the individualistic view of the world value self-achievement, then of course freedom is very, very important for self-achievement. And equally important is that people are equal before the law, because that's the precondition for people to be able to achieve themselves. And people see themselves as citizens on equal footing with other citizens who are going to design institutions in a way that enables them to achieve their what is important, what gives meaning to their life. And so not only you need equality before the law, but you need to limit governments to protect individual freedom, and so you want government to be designed in a way that is compatible with the values of the individualistic culture. Collectivist culture, on the other hand, emphasizes more the necessity of a benevolent ruler to create stability between different clans and groups, because people see themselves as being part of a particular group, whether it's a clan, a group, really, it's very different across countries. And there, the ruler is one who is going to help create balance between these different groups. And so in the collectivist culture, there's more emphasis on hierarchy, order, and freedom is more frowned upon because it's seen as endangering stability. So now, what's our theory? So we have a model. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to be as non-technical as possible today. We have a model where we argue that individualistic culture might be less good at overcoming collective action because there's a bigger coordination problem when people try to achieve their own goals. It's very difficult to coordinate. A collectivist culture might be better at that, but nevertheless, in equilibrium, the individualistic culture over time will end up earlier with democracy, while collectivist culture may have more occurrence of revolts, but may get stuck with quote-unquote good autocratic regimes, because when they have that, then they're going to stick with it. So very quickly, just so that you look at the data. So on the horizontal axis, you have the individualism index. So more to the right, you have more individualistic countries. To the left, you have more collectivist countries. And then on the vertical axis, you have a 30-year average of the polity index. Polity index was mentioned by Adam Przeworski yesterday. So this gives an average, and there's enough variation that this includes, what Huntington called the third wave of democratization. So you see there's a lot of variation. So this is just, look at the data, but you see quickly that there is a positive correlation. You also see that many MENA countries are actually a little bit in the middle of the index, but are quite low in terms of the polity index. I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Also, something that is sort of consistent with the theory is that here this is data from Barbara Geddes and co-authors looking at autocracies. So if you look at the probability of an autocracy breakdown and its association with individualism, then you see that there's a negative correlation, which is consistent with the idea that in the collectivist culture there will be a higher probability of autocracy breakdown. Autocracy breakdown does not mean transition to democracy, it just means that basically there's a breakdown of the existing regime. Okay, now, when we think about this empirically, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And obviously, the first thing that we can say is that there might be a two-way effect between individualism and democracy. Individualism might affect the demand for democracy, but it might also be that people live long enough for democracy, they will develop values of individualism. And so you can argue that the causality goes both ways. So we want to measure the one-way effect from culture to democracy. We need an instrumental variable. And so the one we took was historical pathogen prevalence, that is, pathogen prevalence in various countries before the 20th century, so going as far as we could in history. And some psychologists have shown that there is a direct link between pathogen prevalence and collectivism, because higher pathogen prevalence pushed communities to adopt more collectivist values, emphasizing tradition, putting stronger limits on individual behavior, and showing less openness towards foreigners. And so the idea is that communities that adopted those values in this environment would develop better than communities that did not develop those values. It's not that the values adapted automatically to the environment. There will be some kind of selection process leading to have more collectivist values in that kind of environment. And so econometrically, this satisfies the exclusion restriction. There is no link from historical pathogen prevalence to either democracy or autocracy. Autocracy is not necessarily better than democracy at dealing with this, so you can make that argument. We also use another instrumental variable, which is the Euclidean distance between a frequency of different blood types in a given country compared to the most individualistic countries, which are the US and UK. This is based on data by Cavalli Sforza et al., who have been doing large-scale research in a context where they want to show that there's no such thing as race, but these data are useful for many other topics. And so this genetic distance, if you will, can be understood as a proxy for cultural transmission. Countries where there's more, that are closer to each other, where you have more intermarriage, they will transmit their culture to their children, but they also transmit their genes. We don't measure the culture that is transmitted, but we do measure the genes that are transmitted. So that can be understood as a proxy for cultural transmission. So there's no direct link from genes to culture. This is really to see as a proxy for transmission of cultural values, which we know goes mostly from parents to children. Now, doing that, we also try to see how robust is this link from individualism to democracy. And it's actually robust when taking controls for conflict, even putting religion in there, measures of institutions, whatever measures of institutions. There are measures of inequality, fractionalization, like ethnic fractionalization, linguistic fractionalization, and even education and income. I should add, after Brahim al-Badawi's talk yesterday, it's also robust to including countries that are resource rich. So now, coming back to income, we have another paper where we show empirically that countries that have a more individualistic culture have more innovation and higher long-term growth. So again, this is in the growth literature, controlling for all variables in the growth literature, such as institutions, human capital, etc., etc. So there, the idea from our theory is that there is social status reward given to innovation, not just monetary incentive. There's also people want to be famous. That's part of the individualistic culture. While collectivism gives superiority in coordination. And so the idea here is that the superiority in coordination of the collectivist culture is good for manufacturing, but is a static advantage. Whereas the advantage in innovation is more a dynamic advantage, so the dynamic advantage trumps the static advantage. Now, I have to say that it's really difficult to disentangle the direct effect of income on democratization and its indirect effects via individualism, because we show that individualism leads to higher income, but then what is the direct effect from income to democratization? we have really no way to tell. The only conclusion that I think we can make is that there's a clear and robust effect of individualism on democracy. So there are clearly other variables that are important. This is clearly not the whole story, but I'm quite convinced that culture does play a significant role on democracy. How does this relate to MENA countries? So here I want to apologize because I'm quite ignorant of many aspects of MENA countries, but just if I relate this to the research I just showed you, I think it's quite clear that in the Hofstadter data on the individualism collectivism axis, so MENA countries are quite in the middle. They're quite in the middle, like Russia or Turkey or a little bit lower than Brazil, but they're not really, on the collectivist side. It's more Asian countries that are on the collectivist part. But they do have a much lower polity score. That's clear. That's, on average, much lower polity score. So if this cultural theory that I'm proposing to you is correct, then there should be reasons to be optimistic in the long run for MENA. Of course, if we believe the theory, but what can we say about the short run? Really, not much. It's just very uncertain. And one thing that plays a role there is that they have not had any experience of democracy. So they think something that's really specific, and that has to do with the history of the MENA countries. With their deep history is the lack of experience of democracy. And so a lot of research shows that when you adopt democracy, most reversals of democracy take place only a few years after a regime change. I think that's pretty well established. Now, why is it that once you had a number of years of democracy that kind of stabilized? It's not really clear, but certainly it is a fact. Now, to conclude, culture changes only very slowly. So I don't think it makes sense to say, well, to stabilize democracy, you need to change the culture. That's not going to happen. It's much easier. Political change is much faster than cultural change. Nevertheless, I would argue that strong public debates are needed between proponents and opponents of democracy. This is really a struggle. I don't want to say this because I think it doesn't sound good given the historical context, win the hearts and minds, that brings us bad memories. But there really is the need for debates to convince people that democracy is the better system. Less than 100 years ago, this was the case in Europe. In the 19th century, in the first half of the 20th century, there were active debates. A country like France, that I know very well because that's my culture, in the interwar periods, there were open debates between the proponents and opponents of democracy, and you could be in favor of one or the other. There was no taboo at that time. History has decided, because the horrors of the non-democratic regimes have convinced people that democracy is a better choice, but there really is the need to foster debates. And of course, it's easier to win these debates when you're pro-democratic if the values in the country are closer to individuals, because you have to appeal to people's core values to argue for democracy. Now, that being said, I just want to agree with everything that's been said by the previous speakers, that inclusive democracy is important to avoid tyranny of the majority. Political institutions with strong separation of powers between branches of government prevent too much concentration of power and are stabilizing, even at the cost of possible paralysis of decision-making. So I think everything that was said so far is clearly correct. Trying to introduce the institutions of the French Fifth Republic are not necessarily the good choice, because they would lead to too much centralization. So decentralization, federalism also help coping with geographical political heterogeneity and allow to empower civil society, particularly in those countries where civil society is less developed. Thank you very much.